Jaylen Carter had always known the challenges that came with being a black teenager in a predominantly white neighborhood. But what he never expected was to face racial profiling on a day that should have been like any other. Jaylen was a 17-year-old high school senior, known in his community for his skills on the basketball court and his natural charisma. His life was centered around school, sports, and dreams of a future beyond the limits of his small town. But today, everything would change. It all started at the corner store, a local spot where Jaylen often stopped after practice to grab a snack. He walked in, his gym bag slung over his shoulder, and greeted Mrs. Harris, the cashier who had known him since he was a kid. "Hey, Mrs. Harris," Jaylen said, heading straight to the snack aisle. "Hey there, Jaylen. You getting your usual today?" Mrs. Harris said, scanning his movements as he grabbed a bag of chips and a soda. But today was different. As Jaylen approached the counter, the door to the store swung open with a sudden force, and two police officers stepped in. Jaylen recognized them from around the neighborhood. Officer Blake and Officer Daniels weren't exactly strangers, but what they did next would set the tone for the rest of the day. "Hey you, what are you doing here?" Officer Blake said. Jaylen paused, taken aback by the harshness in the officer's voice. Just getting a snack. What's up?" Jaylen said. "Uh-huh. You're just walking in here? Don't look like you belong in this area," Officer Daniels said. The words stung, even if they weren't new. Jaylen had dealt with this kind of treatment before, but today felt different. His heart pounded, but he refused to let fear take control. "I live here. I go to school down the street. I'm just grabbing a snack. Why are you questioning me?" Jaylen said. "Let's see what you've got there," Officer Blake said. The officer motioned toward the bag in Jaylen's hand. "It's chips and a soda. You want to see?" "I'm not hiding anything," Jaylen said. Jaylen's voice remained calm, though inside his frustration was building. The officers exchanged a glance, their stance tightening. "We've had reports of some issues around here. You sure you're just a local kid?" Officer Daniels said. "Yeah, I'm sure. You've seen me around before," Jaylen said. Jaylen's heart raced as Officer Blake stepped closer. He could feel the tension thick in the air. The officers clearly weren't going to back off without making a scene. Jaylen was used to this, but that didn't make it any easier. He thought about walking out. Maybe it wasn't worth the trouble. Maybe he could just let it slide. But the memory of every time he had been stopped, questioned, or treated differently because of the color of his skin flared up. He wasn't just another black teenager to be intimidated. "You're stopping me because of how I look, right? Because I'm black. That's why I'm being treated like this. What am I doing wrong? I'm just a kid trying to grab a snack," Jaylen said. "Watch your tone. We're just doing our job here," Officer Blake said. Jaylen stood his ground, staring at the officers. He wasn't going to let them make him feel small, not this time. "You know what? I don't need to prove myself to you. I live here. I belong here just like anyone else," Jaylen said. Jaylen's words hit hard, but before either officer could respond, Mrs. Harris spoke up from behind the counter. "That's enough, officers. Jaylen's one of the good kids around here. You're not doing him any favors with this," Mrs. Harris said. For a moment, the officers hesitated, their authority wavering. Jaylen could see their discomfort. They had underestimated him, thinking he'd bow down to their authority. But he wasn't going to let that happen. The officers finally backed off, giving Jaylen one last look before heading out the door. As the bell above the store rang, signaling their departure, Jaylen let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Jaylen stood still, feeling the weight of the situation sink in. Mrs. Harris gave him a small, reassuring smile as he paid for his snack. "You okay, Jaylen? You stood your ground out there," Mrs. Harris said. "I'm fine. Just tired of it, you know? It's like no matter how hard I try, there's always someone out there ready to make me feel like I don't belong," Jaylen said. "You belong, Jaylen. Don't let anyone make you forget that," Mrs. Harris said. As Jaylen walked out of the store, the weight of the situation lingered. But deep down, he knew that the fight wasn't over. It wasn't just about one incident. It was about every single moment that followed. And no matter how many times he was made to feel small, Jaylen wouldn't back down. He had a future to build. and he'd be damned if anyone was going to stop him.